In this lesson, we will discuss the skull, or specifically, the bones of the skull. The etymology of the word skull is Middle English for shell or eggshell, or Old Norse for bald head, and both are appropriate. I'll draw the general outline of the skull, and you can draw along if you would like. I've found that drawing is a good way to learn, so let's begin. So we're going all around there. So now we have the general outline of the skull. I'm going to complete all the structures. Next, I would like to draw the zygomatic arch, something like this. And okay, and then let's draw the jaw. So we want to give our skull teeth. First, start with the incisors, and then the molars. And then I like to draw the orbit. And then finally, we will draw the acoustic meatus, which is the ear hole, and the major sutures. I want to make sure I complete each structure. Okay, I'm going to view it, make sure we've completed the outline. Okay, it looks pretty complete. Starting with the anterior and the superior part of the neurocranium, or the front top of the skull, we have the frontal bone. Now, frontal is Latin for forehead. The frontal bone is located directly above the orbits, and we're going to color the frontal bone yellow. On the opposite side of the neurocranium, at the posterior inferior position, or the lower back of the skull, we have the occipital bone. Occipital is Latin for behind head. Color the occipital bone purple or magenta. This is more of a magenta color. The parietal bone parietal Latin for wall of hollow cavity. There are a pair of bones forming the superior lateral or the top back of the skull. Let's color the parietal bones green. So we'll give them a dark green color. Now, the temporal bones, Latin temporalis or time, are paired bones that are above and surrounding the ears. And in the skeleton, the ear hole is called the acoustic meatus. The time in the term temporalis is referring to the gray hair which appears at your temples. We'll color the temporal bones blue. So notice that the temporal bone is surrounding the acoustic meatus. The sphenoid bone, Greek for wedge-shaped, is a single bone that's behind the orbits. When you view the sphenoid from above, looking down into the skull, you'll be viewing the transverse plane, and the sphenoid is shaped like a butterfly. We will color the sphenoid red. The zygomatic bones, zygomatic is Greek for yoke. They're shaped like a yoke. They're sometimes called the cheekbones, or a pair of bones below and lateral to the orbits. We will color the zygomatic bones a light purple. So here we have the zygomatic bone. Good. Now there are a couple of other bones that we will talk about using the lateral view, and then we'll move to the anterior view and get another view of them, possibly a better view, but I'd like to first identify them in the lateral view. So the first would be the maxilla. Now the maxilla is maxilla means jaw in Latin. And the maxilla bones are a pair of fused bones that make up the upper jaw, and we will color the maxilla tan. Now if you notice, the maxilla actually extend from the upper jaw to the orbital. I want to make sure the structures are complete. So there we have the complete maxilla. I was having a little trouble getting some of the finer points of the bone in the orbital. So notice that, as I said, the maxilla extends from the upper jaw. It is the upper jaw, and extends into the orbital, so it makes up part of the orbital. Next, I'd like to describe the bone, which is the mandible. Mandible, Latin for chewing. And the mandible is the single bone of the lower jaw. We will color this light green. And then I noticed that the sphenoid actually extends down because the sphenoid is behind the orbital and it actually is extending down to this point. So I'm going to color this area. There we go. And then finally, the bone for the Latin term means weeping. That is the lacrimal bone. The lacrimal bone is a small paired bones lateral to the maxilla, and we'll color these light blue. Okay, we've colored our skull, and now as a review, let's actually label the parts. So I will identify a part, and let's try to think of what is the location of the part. So we'll start with the parietal bone. The parietal bone, parietal means wall of hollow cavity. Where is the parietal? So the parietal we've colored green. So here is the parietal. Next, I'd like you to identify the sphenoid bone. Remember, the sphenoid bone, sphenoid means wedge-shaped, and when viewed from above, it forms a butterfly, but it actually makes up the neurocranium and the back of the orbital. So where is the sphenoid? The sphenoid, we colored it in red. So here's the sphenoid. Is this bone? Next, I'd like us to identify the zygomatic bone. Remember, zygomatic means yolk, and this is a yolk-shaped bone. And the zygomatic is also called the cheekbones. And the zygomatic, we colored light purple. So here's the zygomatic or the cheekbone. Next, I'd like to identify the temporal bone. The temporal bone, remember, surrounds the acoustic meatus or the ear. So here is the temporal bone. It is in blue. The occipital bone. Remember, occipital means back of skull. So where is the occipital bone? We have the occipital bone in magenta, and this is the occipital bone in the back of the skull. Occipital. The weeping bone. The weeping bone is at the position of the tear ducts. So we call this the lacrimal bone, and here is the lacrimal in light blue. The mandible. The mandible, remember, mandible means chewing. So which bone would be a hinged bone involved in chewing? This is in the light green. This would be the mandible. It's the lower jaw. And the name of the bone, maxilla, it means jaw. So which would be the maxilla? Remember, we said the maxilla makes up the upper jaw and part of the orbital. So here is the maxilla. And lastly, the frontal bone. Remember, frontal is Latin for forehead. Which is the frontal bone? We identified the frontal bone using yellow. So here is the frontal or forehead. We learned a number of bones viewing the lateral view in part 1. In the next video, skull bones part 2, we're using a frontal view of the skull to get a different perspective.